All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's bi-monthly science webinar for Health Data Research UK. A bit frozen, apologies. For those of you who are new to these webinars, they take place at 11 a.m. on the first or second Tuesday every other month, with the next date for your calendars being Tuesday, the 7th of September, after we've all had a little summer break. So these webinars include a diverse range of research talks and fireside chats aimed at members of HDR UK's community across the substantial sites, the hubs, alliance, fellows, PhD students, patient and public groups, and more. The webinar is also open to the wider health data science community as well as the public. And given that the purpose of these webinars really is to build that one institute ethos, despite our distributed setup, we want this really to be two-way and interactive. So if at any point you have a question, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on how you set up Zoom. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. My name is Hollydawn. I'm the research manager here at HDR UK Central. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Sophie Young and Janet Allen. And both of our speakers today will be covering clinical AI decision-making tools that were commissioned as part of an innovative partnership between Health Data Research UK and the Health Foundation. And each of the tools you'll see presented today was created in an extremely fast 12 months, each integrating the use of large-scale data and advanced analytics into clinical practice to really demonstrate improvement. And at the end of the hour, we'll end with Kay, who is the Digital Hub's program manager here at HDR UK Central. And she's going to give us a roundup of recent updates from across the organization. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand the baton to Sophie, who's going to give us sort of a 15-minute glimpse into prediction tools enabling better informed decisions around treatment and self-management for diabetes patients. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. So over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Holly. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, so please bear with me while I do that. So thank you very much for asking us to present today. So my name is Sophie Young from Imperial College Health Partners, and I'm presenting on behalf of Tony Willis, who is our project lead and the clinical director for diabetes in North West London, and my colleague Scott Cunningham from My Way Digital Health and Jack Halligan from the Institute of Global Health Innovation at ICL are also here to present on the technical and evaluation aspects of the project. So RADAR is a project looking at risk algorithms for decision support and adverse outcomes reduction, and it's part of the Better Care programme. So as Holly mentioned, this was a one-year project which started in May 2020 and it finished in May this year. And we had a number of project partners from industry, NHS and academia listed here who made this project possible. So today we hope to cover the project background and aims, an overview of the model revalidation work we carried out, our stakeholder engagement and the technical work and evaluation, and finally the next steps in terms of moving forward. So to give you some background to the project, diabetes is one of the greatest challenges facing the NHS. In North West London alone, 150,000 people have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and over 40% of hospital admissions are for people with type 2 diabetes, with a further 150,000 people at high risk of developing it. And evidence has shown that early assessment of the risk of complications for these patients and early targeted interventions for those at high risk can reduce mortality, hospital admissions, and complications for these patients. So the RADAR project aimed to make use of diabetes risk prediction models, which were developed in Scotland by My Way Digital Health. And these models predict risk of complications for patients with type 2 diabetes. We then aim to apply these to North West London by revalidating them in a more ethnically diverse population, the North West London's longitudinally linked dataset Discover. We then aim to link these to end user interfaces for clinicians and patients, enabling clinicians to view risks for patients at an individual and a population level, and for patients to be able to view their own levels of risk. We then aim to work with patients and clinicians to understand their requirements and how they might use these tools, making the necessary changes as we went through before evaluating them in an iterative process. So this slide shows the Better Care loop and the core areas in which the RADAR project fits in. So these are around analysing and extracting data insights, developing algorithms and decision support tools, and then piloting the use of these tools. So the first step of the project was the model revalidation, and the project supported validation of several models focusing on both short and long-term type 2 diabetes complications. The models had been developed originally in the NHS Scotland datasets, including some originally from literature-based models. And one aim of the project was to apply these to the North West London type 2 diabetes data to assess model performance, and then also to develop several meta models, with the hypothesis being that the meta models would outperform the individual literature derived models in predicting outcomes for patients. So the team looked specifically at models for mortality, cardiovascular disease, and a composite model for use within the patient interface. And this was because previous work in Scotland found that patients found that individual complication risk display was a bit too detailed and slightly confusing. So that was really streamlined for this project. So just to give an idea of the meta models, the idea is that they take advantage of the potential for models designed to predict one outcome. So for example, type 2 diabetes associated renal impairment, to predict another outcome such as amputation. So for each outcome, a new model was trained taking the outputs of all of the base models as inputs, and the final trained model weights the output of each base model appropriately to obtain the best predictive performance for each outcome. So in terms of our key findings, what we found was that the meta models actually outperformed the base literature derived models in all cases where tested as hypothesized. As you can see in this diagram here, the base models on the left, their performance compared to the meta models here on the right. So again, even without the use of the meta models, the performance of the literature-based models was similar in the North West London to the performance in the Scottish data set as well. So moving forward from the model revalidation, we held a series of workshops with people living with diabetes and also with clinicians in order to gather their feedback on the MyWay end user interfaces, in which the risk prediction scores generated by the models would be presented back to patients and clinicians. So we gathered really valuable feedback, which resulted in quite a few changes to the tools, which Scott will run through shortly. And the tools were then re-evaluated in the final phase of the project by patients and clinicians who had not been involved in the initial workshops to get a fresh perspective. And any changes that weren't incorporated because of the scope of the project were listed and prioritised as potential future changes on scaling of the tools. So just to give you an example of some of the feedback we received on the potential value of the tools, we found that clinicians really valued having all of the key information for patients in one place, as we found that a lot of clinicians find they have to open multiple different sources and screens to get all of the results that they need to have a meaningful interaction with the patient. Whereas this tool offers the opportunity for all of the information they require to be in that one place. And we also found that people living with diabetes really valued being able to see this information and how they could take action, feeling empowered by the tool. So I'll now hand over to Scott, who's going to run through some of the changes that were made to the tool based on the feedback and also some of the technical work as well.
Sophie, are you going to move through the slides for me as well?
Yes, I will.
Superb, thank you. Yeah, so this is just some examples of some of the changes that we made to the screens, primarily focusing on what the patients would see. There's quite a lot of complex concepts that we're trying to articulate here. So we wanted to try and make sure that the front end was understandable to the patients who are actually using it. So one of the sort of easier changes, I suppose, was that we made some changes to the consistent use of wording. So if you move on, Sophie, you'll see some of the areas that we just updated. Yeah, so it's just making the wording consistent around the use of my lifestyle, my experience, and so on. If you move on. And we also added, we had the risk prediction outputs presented in a part of the screen that wasn't immediately obvious what we were doing there. So we tried to make that much more clear by adding an extra banner at the top there. You move on. And this is where it starts to get a bit more interesting, is how we're actually allowing patients to predict or set goals for themselves and set changes to things like their weight, see how that would then impact on their other clinical parameters. So this is an example here of the patient being able to move a slider and then showing if they lose a particular amount of weight, what impact that can potentially have on their HbA1c and ultimately their body mass index. What this example is showing here is that when somebody starts doing that, there's a pop-up to show you some further information about what's happening on screen here, so that people can hopefully more clearly understand what they're seeing and what information is presented there. Can we move on? And again, as I mentioned there about some of the concepts and trying to make people understand as much as possible what is shown on screen. So based on the models that Sophie mentioned earlier on, we come up with a percentage chance of the person sort of developing some of these complications. So what we added was a panel, which hopefully explained in quite simple terms that if there were 100 people with a similar health status to you, in this case 26 would be expected to develop a diabetes-related complication. If we can move on. And then some of the feedback again from the evaluation was, okay, so what do I do with that information? So what we've actually been adding now and more recently is some further information on how the page works. So we've got text-based information and instruction videos. And we've also changed some of the wording around about how do I compare with people within the general population and people with the same healthcare parameters as myself in terms of age, diabetes type, duration of disease, and so on. And again, just in terms of giving the patient information that they can use to more effectively understand what to do next, we've got a sort of positive message that comes up on screen to give the person a lot of simple sort of suggestions and recommendations on what they can do in a practical way to improve their diabetes control and hopefully reduce the risk of developing the diabetes complications that we're talking about here. Move on. And some of the updates that happen as part of the sort of risk prediction that's shown earlier on, we can use to set goals for the individual. So within the screens of the patient-facing platform, the person can actually set their own goals, but based on the risk prediction that we showed earlier on, we can actually say, okay, well, if I reduce my weight by X kilograms, that will have an impact on my HbA1c, and you can choose to actually set that as my goal for the next 6 months at that point as well, and then review that as part of the platform. There will then be notifications and alerts as you approach the due date for these goals to hopefully monitor progress and encourage people to try and hit those targets they've set for themselves. We can move on. And this is just the final slide. I'm not going to get too technical here, but just to explain how we actually got the data to populate the platform in the first place. So the clinician-facing platform and the patient-facing platform, which is known as the No Diabetes Service across North West London, we collect data through the Discovery Data Service. That collects data at the moment from practice-based systems such as EMIS and System 1. That information flows through as a bulk extract, and we get overnight feeds of the data via the VitraCare Dynamic Health Systems platform and into our No Diabetes MyWay clinical platform. I will stop the technical discussion there and move on to, I think, Jack's next.
Thank you, Scott. We'll hand over to Jack to run through the evaluation.
Lovely. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Sophie. You can hear me, I'm assuming, given the silence. My name is Jack Halligan. I'm from the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. So with the new risk prediction features to the new web page that was used to communicate the risk prediction, we tested that interface with people with diabetes and clinicians in Northwest London to get feedback on the usability and acceptability of the tools. We used think aloud methods to assess them, where essentially we show the web page to participants in these sessions. So they're one-to-one sessions with either a person with diabetes or a clinician, so in this case GPs. And then we ask them to navigate through the website while speaking out loud what it is that they're doing, what it is that they're thinking, what might be a little bit confusing. And then we take that information and collate it into themes. So participants were recruited, or participants with type 2 diabetes were recruited through the North West London Health Research Register, which is hosted by ICHB in North West London, which we use to identify people with type 2 diabetes, reach out to them, see if they're interested, and then conduct these 1-hour sessions. and the clinicians were recruited through our professional network in North West London. Thank you, Sophie. So as mentioned, we, with the notes from these 12 sessions, so 6 with people with diabetes and 6 with clinicians, we collated them into themes. This is the summary analysis from the patient sessions, which shows kind of the themes that we grouped into. So presentation of information, navigation through the website, color scheme, what worked and what didn't work there, use of graphics and icons, the autonomy that it may or may not have given patients, and the terminology that was used. So I might just ask you to go to the next slide, Sophie, and I can talk you through some of the example pieces of feedback that we got from patients and clinicians. So in this was, again, quite an early version that had come back. There was still some development work ongoing as we came to the end of the project. So we did test a very early version with patients. There was some confusion, for example, when we showed them the risk prediction output as to whether it was showing their risk of developing diabetes or whether it was showing their risk of developing complications with diabetes. I know at the time some further explanatory information was being added to the site, but wasn't available when we started the evaluation. But just to give you an insight into the types of feedback that we got. So next slide, please, Sophie. We did get quite a bit of positive feedback from patients and clinicians as well. Obviously, patients saying that they being able to see the impact of changing lifestyle parameters on their risk gives them motivation to do things like lose weight and quit smoking. Next slide, please, Sophie. And then also we, this is the output that we tested with GPs. We got quite a lot of interesting feedback from GPs. All of the 6 that we asked said that they would find this tool useful in clinical practice. I think one of the more interesting things that we heard back was comparing it to QRisk. So QRisk, for those of you who may not be aware, is a tool used by clinicians to understand somebody's risk of developing cardiovascular disease, so having a heart attack or stroke or anything else. The tool is, there's an understanding of above what percentage, or, if your QRisk score is above, I think it's 20%, for example, they recommend that you start on a statin or a cholesterol lowering drug. I think what the clinicians' feedback was when we showed these risks to them is it's difficult to know what action I need to take based on the risk being high, medium, low, or above X%. What is it that I need to do? Which I thought was interesting. Next slide. And some of the positive feedback again. So basically, one of the clinicians was communicating that it'd be quite difficult to communicate why it's important to take a new medication or why it's important to change a lifestyle decision. Whereas if you can show percentage risk of developing complications that actually mean something to the patient, for example, blindness or risk of amputation, it can be much easier to explain those. Is that the last slide, Sophie? I think I might be handing it back over to you. No, oh, one more, apologies. I should know where I'm going. Yeah, so this was another piece of feedback on what the GPs being a little bit confused as to what was meant by low, medium, and high. Some of the pages did explain this at a high level, but I think more information to explain what is meant by low, medium, and high risk and how that was informed is important for GPs. Otherwise, they can find it difficult to explain to patients why they have come out at low, medium, and high. I think the difference between, for example, this tool and the QRisk tool is GPs type in the patient results into QRisk, so they know exactly what's informed it. Whereas this, they can assume that it's calculated from data from the dashboard, but perhaps don't understand exactly what weighting is given to each of those parameters, which can make them a little bit uncomfortable. But that's everything for me from the evaluation. If you'd like to learn more about it, very happy for you to reach out to me. I'm on the invite from today about how we evaluate software. but I'll pass you back over to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. So as Jack and Scott mentioned, that we gained a huge amount of insight on the tools and key kind of changes that needed to be made, and ongoing changes to continue to improve the tools. And we're hopeful that the outputs from this project will be able to support next stage regulatory testing, solutions dissemination, and also support the business case for wider deployment. We're also looking at, we think that future work should include more in terms of an impact on clinical outcomes, such as metabolic changes and the 9 national care process measures. So things like eye and foot screening being measured in the last 12 months. As this project was quite a short project, these were elements that we couldn't capture. So other assessments might include the impact on drug prescribing habits, budget, service efficiency, and also on patient experience, with longer term studies also looking at the actual acute and chronic complication event rates, and what the impact of these tools might be on those. And then in terms of kind of the wider picture and scaling, an approach focused on using PCNs would be able to support the development of network models and approaches to chronic disease management. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Please do raise any questions that you might have for the team.
Great, thank you, Sophie, Jack, and Scott. That was wonderful, and a really good example of user, in this case, GP, clinician, and patient engagement, really making a difference in the final outputs. And really incredible to see the impact you've delivered in such a short time scale. So I'd encourage everyone to put any questions into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll kick us off. In getting this off the ground, you know, it was quite quick, it was during the pandemic. Are there any lessons or key takeaways that have emerged that others might find valuable?
Thanks, Holly. That's a good question, and I'll kick off, and then please do jump in. Scott or Tony, who's the project lead, has also joined us today and may be able to give some additional thoughts. But certainly we found that in the pandemic, we had to think on our feet in terms of the patient and stakeholder engagement. Everything had to be virtual, but actually that didn't impact us too much. We found that actually people were really happy to be engaged in a virtual setting, and in some ways it actually made it sometimes a little bit easier to get things organised and to move things quickly, not having to get everybody across to the same place. Tony, Scott, and Jack, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, shall I come in on that? So I think it was really helpful that we'd already got existing working arrangements with My Way. So we'd already done a lot of the data, you know, the sort of the data integration work. So that was key. We'd done all the information governance requirements, and those are the things that tend to take time. So we'd got that groundwork already completed, and so the main thing then was this implementation of the risk algorithms and the testing with patients. So that really helped. I think it helped as well to have a really good data set. So we've got a longitudinal data set in Northwest London that, you know, goes back to digitization of GP records, so back to about 2000 something, probably 2003 or thereabouts. So that was really helpful in terms of having good quality data that the research team could work with.
Thank you. And there's a few more questions in the chat. I'll pick up one more, but maybe afterwards, if you guys have a chance to answer within the chat directly, the ones that are remaining. Melissa has asked, what would need to happen to really scale this project up to serve all people with diabetes within the UK?
Will I come in on that? Yeah, so as you, I'm sure, are aware that within every part of the UK, most large areas have their own ways of doing things. So in London, Northwest London, there's quite a mature data infrastructure that allowed us to collect the information that we needed to support this project. And as Tony mentioned there, safe havens and so on, the WSIC system, where we could actually access that longitudinal data to validate the models, was a key part of this. In terms of actually accessing the data, MyWay Digital Health have now got access to, or can connect directly to, all EMIS practices across NHS England and Wales. We're currently working with Vision and System 1 to implement the same sort of interfacing. So we're kind of working towards having the infrastructure and architecture in place to support that. It would just, in terms of, it always seems to be, it's easy, it's not easy, it's possible to do things technically. Sometimes you need to have the buy-in clinically and from the relevant commissioners in place to do that. So technically we could do this, we could start a programme tomorrow if you wanted us to do that. But yeah, we need to have support across the whole of NHS England.
Brilliant. Thank you, Scott. And thank you all for your time. Again, there's a few questions in the chat. If you do have the time to stay on and answer those, that would be great. Next, we're going to speak with Janet. She's going to present her work on the use of AI for earlier identification of potential flare-ups in patients with cystic fibrosis. And again, at the end of Janet's talk, we will open up the floor for about 5 minutes for questions.
Good morning, everybody. So basically, my name is Janet Allen, and I'm here to represent the team members for Project Breathe. Next, please. So this is an interdisciplinary research program that was led by Charlie Howarth at Papworth Hospital. He's a senior CF physician, cystic fibrosis physician. The co-applicants were from the University of Cambridge with Professor Flotto and Dr. John Wynne from Microsoft Research. And the program was supported by development of an app with Kirsty Hill, who is at Magic Bullet, which is a social enterprise company. Our focus has been very much on empowerment. I just want to briefly, thank you, Holly, next, thank you. So I just wanted to give background on cystic fibrosis, which is abbreviated to CF. It's effectively a genetic condition, and the gene was identified over 30 years ago, and basically there are mutations in a chloride channel. The chloride channel basically is on surface epithelial cells and allows water to the surface of surface epithelial cells. If the channel is not functioning, then surface epithelial cells are dry. And so this results in the phenotype of CF. There are over 10,000 people in the UK with CF, and they are managed through 59 CF centres. The phenotype is very specific, and it affects multiple organs. So basically, in the past, before all the genetics came through, mothers of babies with CF would quite often comment that when they kissed the baby, they could taste salt. And this is because the salt concentration in the sweat is very high. The major problem is that the airways and the gut and the pancreatic duct are not properly hydrated, and as a result, there's thick, sticky mucus in the airways. The intestine results in intestinal malabsorption, and pancreatic dysfunction means that the enzymes created in the pancreas to digest food are not released, and there's an associated CF-related diabetes. On the right-hand side, show a picture of normal lungs, and also then show the picture of lungs in cystic fibrosis. There are continual bouts of infection and inflammation that result in lung damage, and the lung damage is progressive from day one, and it is calculated to be about 2% per annum. So the average life expectancy of someone is, I think, now 31. One of the key features about CF is that it has long periods of stability where no interventions are required. Patients are on standard therapies and they are relatively well, but these are punctuated by periods of acute exacerbation resulting from pulmonary infections. And these pulmonary infections require intravenous antibiotics, usually for 2 weeks, sometimes for 4. And as I say, it doesn't stop the inflammatory process that goes alongside this, but there's progressive loss of lung function. One of the features for CF is that it results in a very heavy burden of care for both the patients, the healthcare providers, and the healthcare payers. Next slide, please. So in the NHS long-term plan, there was a clear need to reform how chronic conditions are being managed. And they were proposing in the NHS long-term plan that we should be looking for digital solutions to relieve some of the outpatient pressure for chronic conditions. And associated with this was the Topple report, which talked about the need to educate the workforce. Next slide. So we asked the question for CF is, can we use technology to reduce routine clinical attendance? Why does somebody have to go to a clinic just to be told they're well, everything is fine, and they can go home again? This exposes people to infections and is a very high burden of care. And we were looking to see if we could use technologies to reduce this burden of care. This would free up time of the clinicians to see the people who really needed to be seen. And we've calculated that by putting this in place, just avoiding one outpatient visit would cover the costs of implementation. So next slide, please. So the first study we did was funded by the CF Trust, and basically it was called Smart Care. And this was an entire feasibility study. It was a multi-centre study that was run from Papworth and was run across 7 centres. We effectively asked people to do daily measurements of spirometry, their activity, weight, and oximetry. So lung function, how active they were. Weight is obvious. Oximetry gives you the measure of oxygen saturation and is another independent marker of lung function. This program was not intended to produce any clinical tools or clinical decision-making tools. It was effectively a way just to establish whether it was possible to do. And the learnings from this program was that the vast majority of people liked seeing their data, have endless quotes if you want to see them. We found there were concerns amongst the physicians that we may induce anxiety in people by asking them to do this, and when they see changes that they might overreact. We found this was the exact opposite, actually. Very few patients had to stop because of increased anxiety. And we found that patients felt empowered by this. This was really quite an unexpected finding, and we only really have anecdotal data as a result because we didn't anticipate it, so didn't put in place measures. But effectively, people would take their phones with them to their outpatient appointment. And when the doctor said to them, "How are you feeling?" they would take their phones out and they would present it to the doctor and say, "Well, this is what's been happening to me over the last 2 months." The other thing we found was that people also started to learn to see their own measures and adjust their lifestyle accordingly. There's one particular example where a patient was being hospitalized 3 times a year minimum for acute exacerbations. And she started on Smart Care and she continued long after the study had finished. And briefly, over a 2-year period, while she was using Smart Care, she wasn't admitted to hospital for IV antibiotics once. That's a phenomenal effect. And she effectively had learned what mattered to her and what she could do to restore her function back to normal, whether it was more chest physio or more exercise. So the empowerment feature was something that really took us by surprise. Next slide, please. Next slide. So building on Smart Care, we started Project Breathe, and we implemented a lot of the learnings that we obtained from the Smart Care program. And this is run as an app independent of health informatics services. We wanted to ask the question, can we safely reduce routine outpatient visits by 50%? So we based it at Papworth only to begin with, because this is quite a radical thing to do, to say to people, you don't need to go to outpatients anymore, and we needed to know it was safe and properly being managed. The difference here is that with an individual's consent, the data was provided on a named patient basis to the CF Centre, and we developed a clinic portal with a dashboard, and the data was also sent anonymised for machine learning. Next, please. So this is the dashboard that was developed. So basically, any member of the multidisciplinary team can see this dashboard and see someone's trends over a period of time. Next slide, please. What we arranged was that a week before a routine outpatient visit, there would be a telephone consultation between a research nurse, and not the whole multidisciplinary team, but a research nurse and the individual. They would both be looking at their data at the same time, and they would have a discussion over about half an hour where they would make a decision as to whether it was safe for them not to come to the clinic. Next slide, please. So before the coronavirus lockdown, we found that we were able to reduce a minimum of 50% of the routine visits. Some patients were keen to not attend. No, yeah. We also demonstrated that it was safe. And I think one of the features about this is it's a partnership in decision making. It's not the doctor telling the patient what to do, but it's basically decision making by the patient and the research nurse. I put up here 4 quotes to say we have many, many more. And effectively, people did like it. In fact, the initial study was restricted in numbers, and we were under a lot of pressure to increase the numbers. And next slide. So the question was whether we could use supervised machine learning to predict flare-ups or exacerbations. So with this increased frequency of data, were we able to see flare-ups before they were treated? And this is the work by Andre Flotter and John Wynne, and pictures the Microsoft Research Unit in Cambridge. Next slide. So this was the algorithm development, and effectively this was started on the SmartCare data, so it was retrospective. And we used the data effectively in an unsupervised way, to develop an understanding of what exacerbations were. And we, on the left-hand side, effectively show you here what happens to all the measurements that we were doing. And we were able to pinpoint the start of an exacerbation, and we were able to follow the measurements over the period of the exacerbation before treatment started. Next question was, can the algorithm predict in real time? And that's part of the work that's funded by the HDR UK. On the right-hand side, we used the outputs of the alignment model that we created on the left-hand side and to create training labels that could be used as supervised classifiers to generate a prediction, a daily prediction of risk. And here are 2 examples. At the bottom, there is the prediction, and you can see that the prediction rises well in advance of the actual time that treatment starts. The treatment is in the shaded area. Next slide, please. So what was the impact of the coronavirus? This was a major problem for us, but it was probably beneficial in the long term, just as you've heard from the diabetes group. People with CF were shielded, and that meant overnight there were no face-to-face visits to CF centres. There were no clinical decision support tools in place, and this was causing difficulties both for patients and for the multidisciplinary teams. With the support of the HDR, we were able to accelerate enrolment at Papworth, and this was very much patient-led. In the application to HDR, I had a phased recruitment, whereas we actually managed to bring in 50% of our planned recruitment within the first 3 months. People were demanding this. We were also able to open additional sites with funding from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the UK, in the US, and we've opened sites now in Cardiff, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and that in itself has been quite a learning exercise with the different responses of the developed nations to the coronavirus. Scotland had very strict interpretation on what studies could be done in the presence of coronavirus, and anything that was not directly related to coronavirus was put on the back burner. So it took us a while to get going there. We've opened an international site in Toronto with CF Canada. As a result of the pandemic, we had discussions with the health commissioners in England to see whether we could roll this out universally across the whole of England. Decision was made that this was still a research tool and that it would be wrong to do that, both from the point of view of not having the infrastructure in place to support a research tool and also to mess up any outcomes from the programme of research. But those discussions with the Health Commissioner were actually very helpful and led us to actually CE mark Class 1, the app as we have it. We now have over 300 adults with CF recruited, and the great thing about this is that it gives us additional data sets to validate and test the resilience of the Breathe algorithm, and that work is ongoing. Next slide. One of the things that we did in parallel with all of this was to make the app available to all. So anybody who wanted to use the app could access the app, download it free of charge. And we know that there's been 1,500 downloads since we made it freely available. The Class 1 CE marking allows us to do this with some confidence. And we also have been keen to uncouple dependence on any device manufacturer. A lot of manufacturers make devices and couple their device to a platform, and you are then totally dependent upon one with the other. One thing we've been trying to do is make sure that the process was device agnostic as far as possible. So now the app can be downloaded onto any smartphone. We've widened the spirometers that can collect data, Bluetooth data, and we've also been able to connect to devices with the Apple Health connectivity, and that gives us access to Garmin, Fitbit, Newer, many different devices. Next slide, please. So where are we in the better care loop? Next, please. So we've identified a burden of care for chronic respiratory conditions. We've estimated this costs about £4 billion per annum for all the chronic respiratory conditions. And this says heavy cost to users and healthcare professionals and the payers. Next slide. We've collected real-world data from 300 plus adults with CF, and we've opened an international arm that will also lead into this program, and that allows us to validate the algorithm. Next, please. The anonymized data sets have been provided to the computer scientists, and we've gone from analyzing this retrospectively to prospectively. So we're starting to do the prediction in real time. Just quite quickly, Holly. Next one. Next slide, please. We've developed a predictive algorithm, and we're testing the resilience and validation. We're planning to test the safety and efficacy of the algorithm in a formal clinical trial. And following that, we will do further CE marking. Have the final slide, please. So where next? Effectively, building on this work, we've successfully applied to the NIHR AI in healthcare and received a grant. This will allow us to validate and test the resilience of the algorithm. And we're planning to convert the algorithm to a Breathe score, an AI Breathe score. And we will be giving this to people directly, to patients directly, in order to predict when an exacerbation is on its way. Our future, we want to future-proof everything by a process that we're calling plug and play, where devices are very rapidly evolving, and we want to test novel devices for their acceptability and to improve the algorithm. And I'll just show on the right-hand side a picture of one particular device that we are exploring the use of, which is a skin patch totally pliable, and measures everything that we're measuring at the current program with Project Breathe in a passive way. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Janet. I was really struck by the quotes you had given from the patients that were involved in how you mentioned the demand was really quite high with that enrollment, 50% quite quickly. I think we have time for one question. So just looking into the chat here, I see we have a question from Melissa, and she apologizes if she missed it, but were CF patients involved in co-production of your project, so that patient-public involvement?
Yeah, this is a unique project in many respects because two of the leads in the program are directly connected with CF, and at every stage, all the design has been done in collaboration with the multidisciplinary teams and the CF community, and we've adapted everything as we're going along. Having the additional sites has been very beneficial because Papworth became quite expert at using the dashboard, and bringing in the additional sites actually allowed us to improve the dashboard enormously.
Great. And I encourage everyone to put any questions for Janet in the chat. And if you can stick around, Janet, and answer the questions in the chat, that'd be great. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Kay, who's going to give you a sort of roundup of what's going on at HDR UK.
Oh, aren't you all so lucky? Sinduja normally does this, so apologies you've got me today. I will be very brief because that was fascinating, Janet. Thank you very much. So if there are any questions and we want to pick them up at the end, I think that would be a really useful use of time. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. So for the brief update, I wanted to first talk about HDR UK Futures, which is powering up your data science skills, which is a fantastic next step on our training strategy, which has introduced a new virtual learning environment, and we've got we've created some bite-sized video courses for you to view and learn from. These are by a cast of really great industry, academic, NHS experts, and our first five videos cover when you do data identifiable, data sharing confidentiality, and the rest that are listed down there. We've got a little taster one that Alex Bailey's done for us there that you can view from our website. This will be developing as we go along, so keep posted for anything else that comes along there, because it really is a great way of bringing together the knowledge that we're learning and the wider institute as we go forward. So they're all done really rather nicely. As an ex-documentary filmmaker, I'm pleased to see that production values are really great on that. So that's briefly there. So I just wanted to talk about, because I deal with the infrastructure side of HDR UK. So I'll talk about the two new hubs that are on the block. So we've got the 7 original, let's call them the originals, Health Data Research Hub. I couldn't alter the image to add some more blobs, so I do apologise for that over the country. So we've got Alleviate, which is the APDP, try saying that when you've had a few too many glasses of wine, Pain Data Research Data Hub, and they're really dealing with chronic pain, and they're part of the larger MRC versus arthritis and e-lolly project, and they're providing the kind of data conduits and curation services for that. They kicked off at the beginning of this month, so they're now running along with the kind of HDR UK programme management, so that we're delivering 3 milestones at various phases of the project. So that's very exciting, so you'll hear more about those coming soon. And then we've got DataMind, which is the new mental health data research hub, looking at how we enable coordinated research and improve lives for mental health. And it's kind of looking to provide a central integrated data infrastructure and utilising the gateway to be able to do this with fair and interoperable methodology. And they're looking at setting up hub infrastructure across the UK 4 nations as well, which will be a great asset. They're due to kick off in November. I'll very briefly touch on this because it might be one for a bit future. So we've started the DARE programme, which is the UK Trusted and Connected Data and Analytics Research Environment Programme. Everybody likes long words, long titles there, and aims to deliver a federated digital infrastructure for the next generation of trusted research environments. This is the UK Research Councils as they joined together in 1718, I believe it was, and it's how we can look at all the data that they get through and the large scale data that they have through their various projects, and we'll review the existing infrastructure and look to how we can join that together in a safe and interoperable way. So the design and dialogue phase kicks off in July. I know Caroline's on the line, so if I get anything wrong, I'm sure she can correct me on the chat, and those are the key areas that DARE is hoping to achieve. But as that goes on, there's going to be more activities in July. We've just, we've nearly recruited a team to deliver that phase. So I think for the next one of these, we'll be able to give a little bit more of an update in August. All the key highlights. We've been dealing with the NHS GP digital data set. So we've got a joint statement from the medical and social research community on the HDR UK website. I think this was, when I checked, is up to about 243 people have signed, and really promotes the use of the proposed GP data set for research data going forward. So if you wanted to have a look at that, please feel free to do so. June saw us the end of June. I'm sure Fran will be very relieved that this is over, but again, did a spectacular job delivering the team delivering 2 hugely successful conferences. I think we had something like 1,500 sign up for the Data Insights in the Pandemic conference and 800 for the National Core Studies across 63 nations as well, which was fabulous. The Black Internship Programme is now underway. That finishes in mid-August, and we've got 49 Black interns across 23 Alliance and Hub partners and HDR UK stakeholders delivering that. We now have over 1,300, I nearly said 13,000, that would be really nice, registered users on the gateway. We're registering 294 data access requests and now have over 650 data sets on there, and we're continuing our development for the quinquennial review. Dates of interest. There aren't that many because we're giving you a bit of a break from events in August because people might want a staycation in Cornwall. I would recommend against it, as I think Cornwall will be slightly busy this summer and the roads are very narrow. So we've got the next Innovation Gateway drop-in, which is Thursday, which will be really interesting, actually, talking about how national data custodians work and how they're using the gateway going forward. And then the next one of these isn't actually in the calendar yet, but certainly I'm sure soon will be on the 7th of September. And if you've got any further questions, please let us know. So I'll stop sharing and hand back to Holly.
That's great. Thank you, Kay. Yeah, so if anyone has any additional questions for Kay or any of the other speakers, please do pop them in the chat. If not, we will finish up by thanking all of our speakers today. It was really insightful and great to hear a bit more about the Better Care Catalyst projects, as well as what's going on at HDR UK. And as Kay said, our next bi-monthly science webinar is on the 7th of September, and I look forward to seeing you then. Lovely. Bye, everyone.